From December 1944 to January of 1945, the battle-hardened Screaming Eagles of the 101st defended the city against determined German attacks.
All right, y'all, welcome back to Combat Arms channel. Okay, so today is Veterans Day here in the US, so I figured we'd do a special video for that. So I found a cool one from the Armchair Historian. So we saw the video that they did previously about the evolution of the British Army uniforms. So today we are checking out the evolution of American Army uniforms, which is kind of cool. We can kind of see like where the US, again, the US military isn't nearly as old as a lot of other militaries. However, they have a pretty good history, and I think it'll be kind of cool to see the uniforms, to see if the uniforms adapt with the sort of conflicts that are going on that the US is actually a part of. I think I'm pretty familiar with a lot of different Marine Corps uniforms, but as far as like American Army uniforms, I'm not too sure, especially if they got like a certain design from another military. So I think this video should be cool, so let's check it out.
Prior to the formation of a professional army, the 13 colonies were defended by militiamen or Minutemen. These Minutemen fought in the opening battles of the American War of Independence, such as the battles of Lexington and Concord. In contrast to the British regulars they fought, they wore a patchwork of civilian clothing. The first American regulars were equipped with muskets, much like the rest of the world. During the first years of
Okay, so it makes sense that the initial Minutemen would just be wearing like civilian clothing. Now, the Army, Marine Corps, and Navy were formed in 1775, but I'd imagine they might not have had a whole lot of funding, especially since once this was happening, the Brits probably weren't going to give them a whole lot of funding, especially to get uniforms. So it might not have been too important on their to-do list, but again, it is nice to be able to get some sort of uniform, so you can get some pride behind that, and also to help differentiate everyone. So Minutemen having civilian clothes makes sense, and then we see the Musketeer coming in, which this looked pretty American. You got the red, white, and blue, so I wonder if they actually chose those specific colors because of the American flag, but I'm not really too sure. So this is 1778, so still a few years left before the Revolutionary War actually ended.
During the first years of their existence, the American military was not formally organized until Prussian officer Friedrich von Steuben disciplined them into a true fighting force at Valley Forge, where American...
Yeah, so honestly, that Prussian officer, von Steuben, is pretty like famous in the U.S. Army, at least, because they created the Blue Book, and that's basically what like NCOs use. That was like the first like NCO manual, non-commissioned officer manual. So like the first like real leader manual was that Blue Book. So it's kind of cool to see that he was able to influence a little bit more as far as like getting some uniforms and some discipline in play, because it really made a difference, honestly. Again, you can really get behind an organization and a feeling and a thought when you have like this iconic look behind it all.
Began habitually wearing uniforms. These newly professionalized soldiers marched to victories at Saratoga, Kings Mountain, and ultimately Yorktown, although Continental militiamen were used extensively for the entirety of the war. Unlike their musketeer counterparts, Morgan's riflemen, who functioned as a light infantry force, carried a true rifle. The grooved barrels of which allowed the musket ball to spin for far greater accuracy. Uniforms of this period maintained a predominantly blue color palette.
So I feel like they went a little bit backwards. So this kind of seems like a step forward, because like when you talk about the riflemen, they were a little bit more professional, like true infantrymen. So their uniforms weren't like super like ostentatious, like super flashy, not really standing out so much. But then they go to like the War of 1812, and it's kind of going back to where it was during the Revolutionary War, which I guess is kind of cool, but I wonder why they made that specific design. Again, these guys might not be specific like riflemen, so maybe the rifleman green was like its own kind of thing.
Period maintained a predominantly blue color palette, although some details of the uniform evinced a Prussian influence, particularly the cuffs and collar. Officers continued to have edged weapons.
Those white pants.
A popular piece for ranked individuals of most armies around the world. The pommels of American sabers were styled after eagles' heads, further cementing the bald eagle as a symbol of American identity.
That's pretty cool. I never saw that
American forces were able to stand their ground and hold the line during the siege of Fort Texas. Although the blue color was still prominent, there was a noticeable change in headwear. soldiers began to wear a type of visor cap in contrast to the taller and somewhat less fashionable shako-style hats.
I mean, again, it's still like really blue, so it's standing out a lot. These guys probably stand out like a sore thumb. But I mean, the hat looks like a military hat, especially a lot more modern as far as today. But even still, it doesn't seem like the best like combat sort of hats. I mean, they have the front visor, so maybe that'll keep like some of the sun out of your eyes and whatnot. But even still, I mean, you still have this white X over their torso and whatnots with these blue uniforms.
Shako-style hats. Union troops, also known as Federals, were outfitted in dark blue tunics and kepi hats borrowed from the French design. While this was the standard uniform for the Union, some regiments opted for entirely different uniforms. When the Confederate States seceded from the Union, the CS Army opted for a more gray and earthy tone. The Confederate soldiers,
so goofy,
for a good part of the early war period, had to make do with older, less effective muskets. Zouaves were a class of light infantry regiments that were linked primarily with the French army units serving in North Africa during the time. In the US, it was a man by the name of Elmer E. Ellsworth who, before the war, ran a drill company called the Zouave Cadets, who practiced in the manner of their French namesakes.
That's pretty
Such
cool.
units were raised on both sides of the war, such as the Union's 11th New York Infantry, the New York Fire Zouaves.
All right, never knew about those guys. Kind of cool. Some urban fighting. You don't really hear about a lot of like urban fighting in the Civil War, right? Because even still, like the tactics were pretty much the same as far as just like these line formations. So it's kind of interesting. Imagine like musket fighting in like CQB sort of environment, doing like some house clearing or whatnot with a musket. Better put that bayonet to use.
As the United States began its expansionist phase, the Army continued to modernize and adapt to the changing battlefield. While previously introduced for far out western territories, the Montana peaked design hat was adopted by the Army as a service cover.
I like it.
The Army at this time also developed a tropical lightweight uniform for its campaigns in East Asia. When the United States entered the Great War, they had adapted much of the appearance of their British counterparts. The steel Brodie helmet, often nicknamed a doughboy helmet, and khaki or olive drab battle dress.
Why doughboy?
The American Expeditionary Force fought its way to victory on the Western Front. The United States saw its ground forces.
Yeah, so with World War I, World War II, you definitely see a big jump as far as modernizing, as far as like trying to match the terrain so they're not sticking out as much, but still having like a uniform so you can differentiate and whatnot. But honestly, I think here, this was a pretty good step forward. I just like that they have like the 5 o'clock shadow, not caring so much about shaving regulations. They have the cool looking like cowboy hat. And then you can see the weapons are modernizing very, very quickly at this point, which is also cool to see how they're putting this in the video.
States saw its ground forces make their debut in Operation Torch, fighting alongside the British in North Africa against the ferocious German Afrika Korps, ultimately driving the Nazis back to the Italian mainland.
Hell yeah. Here we go. This is cool.
Taking note of the effectiveness of the German Fallschirmjäger paratroopers, the U.S. developed their own airborne troops, who contributed greatly to victory in Europe. From the night landings...
You guys see that? This poor dude. Okay. So, actually, I didn't even consider that. It's like, did the U.S. even have any sort of... It sounds like they developed these paratroopers during World War II, which is pretty insane to go from not having any paratroopers to all of a sudden having paratroopers. I mean, like, aircraft were around, especially in military applications, since World War I, but as far as paratroopers, that's kind of interesting to think that we were kind of a little bit late in the game.
In Europe. From the night landings prior to D-Day to the invasion of Germany, American airborne infantry were crucial to the Allies' victory.
What are those patches on the pants? Looks a little
Rangers
weird.
were elite light infantry forces organized in company-size formations. Rangers famously scaled Pointe du Hoc on D-Day to eliminate artillery pieces which the Germans had evacuated just prior. But they also won fame in Italy at the Anzio beachhead prior to Operation Shingle. By the time of the Battle of the Bulge, airborne units had fought through most of German-occupied Europe and now held their own during the siege
now
of
you got some of the
Bastogne.
cold weather
From
stuff.
December 1944 to January of 1945, the battle-hardened Screaming Eagles of the 101st defended the city against determined German attacks.
Good
United
stuff.
States Marines under the U.S.
Hey.
Navy formed the bulk of the ground forces in the Pacific Theater. They carried out the lightning-fast island-hopping campaign across
Finger machine gun. Why have I never heard of this? Why have I never heard of this thing? I mean, it looks very, very crude. I mean, I'm glad that some people had the BAR, because looking at this thing, it looks like it was very much, yeah, it's literally just a freaking Frankenstein weapon, a Grand Stock, aircraft variant of the M2, and a, wow. Okay, I think I do remember hearing about this thing. Now that I'm seeing all the different parts of those weapons, so
Imperial Japanese
of course the
territory,
Marines have
with
it.
Marines planting the stars and stripes on Mount Suribachi during the capture of Iwo Jima, becoming
yeah.
an iconic image of the Second World War. The Army Air Forces was responsible for most of the aerial combat during the war. Widely recognized by their Hap Arnold Wings insignia and their famous winged propeller on their uniforms, the
What about the
Army Air
shades?
Forces were ultimately responsible for the 2 atomic weapons unleashed on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, swiftly, if not controversially, ending the war in the Pacific.
Yeah.
Following the Second World War, they would be split from the Army to become the United States Air Force. Following the end of the Second World War, the United States
Korean
infantrymen
War.
remained relatively unchanged in gear and appearance, though now they were a battle-hardened force experienced on all sides of the globe. By this time, the U.S. military as a whole had been desegregated by Executive Order 9981 of President Truman.
Good
During
stuff.
the
Yeah, honestly, I need to learn more about the Korean War because it's such a fascinating war, and it was just so crappy. The conditions were horrible. Once like the Chinese were coming into play during the Korean War, it was getting like super brutal. And yeah, I need to do my own research and find a little bit more like cool videos about the Korean War specifically. So if you guys have any videos about the Korean War that aren't like too crazy long, like not documentaries, but stuff I can do a reaction to, then throw it down below because we definitely need to see some more Korean War stuff on the channel.
been desegregated by Executive Order 9981 of President Truman. During the Vietnam War, U.S. ground forces fought not only the North Vietnamese and their guerrilla
Big
warfare
change
tactics,
now.
they fought against the tropical conditions of Vietnam itself.
No kidding. Hopefully DEET was included with the uniform. Keep those bugs away.
Uniforms would wear and tear until they disintegrated off of a soldier's body. A torn-up uniform came to be a mark of experience and veterancy.
Good
When the
grief,
war
they didn't
ended,
have
many
more than
found
one?
themselves struggling to readjust to civilian life once they returned home. Vietnam veterans remain the largest population of military vets to this day. In 1990, the Iraqi army marched into Kuwait. This was met with both economic sanctions by United Nations members and the largest coalition of allied nations since the Second World War.
Yeah, the Gulf was insane. And you can even see, like, they're really getting a huge focus on modernizing, just like the normal infantrymen. You got camouflage pretty much as a standard now. Of course, you had some, like, woodland flak jackets and whatnot, so it wasn't necessarily the best matching, but you have the camouflage coming into play, and then you have the weaponry still advancing. Not necessarily like everyone with an optic at this point, because it took a little bit longer, maybe like the late 1990s until everybody had an optic. But you can see the infantryman is advancing really, really quickly at this point.
Live news broadcasts displayed U.S. forces clad in camouflage uniforms attuned to the desert environment during Operation Desert Shield and Operation Desert Storm in the following year.
Chocolate chip pattern.
When Kosovo
That's
declared
kinda weird.
independence in 1999, Serbian forces were sent in to reconquer the breakaway republic and began a campaign of ethnic cleansing. NATO forces intervened and ended the 78-day conflict. U.S. forces were equipped with new body armor derived from earlier flak vests during the Vietnam War.
Oh yeah.
The tragic attacks on September 11, 2001, saw the American troops march into the Middle East to begin the international campaign known as the Global War on Terror. To adjust to the desert environment, troops were issued an improved desert camouflage uniform and equipment that assisted them in this new battlefield dominated by urban combat.
Okay, so you can really start seeing a lot of modernization happening here. So even the footwear, like you're not wearing old leather boots. You don't really need leather so much in this sort of environment. You don't really need like the waterproof stuff. So having like nylon, something that's a little bit lighter, more flexible, more breathable is a lot nicer for an environment like this. You have eye protection pretty much coming as standard. As far as like, it might have been glasses, but more specifically, goggles were very, very common, especially in this sandy environment. Night vision is coming to play. You can see they have the cat eye band, which basically has like glow-in-the-dark tape to help with like identification, especially like nighttime and whatnot. Of course, the optics are coming into play. And then even the body armor, you have these panels, the MOLLE panels, so you can move the pouches around on your body armor. So you can like, you know, change it up depending on what you prefer. It was kind of like that back in the day as well, but not nearly this modular. So it's kind of cool to see all of this coming into play.
This new battlefield dominated by urban combat. In time, the U.S. Army saw fit to consolidate their camouflage patterns. Rather than having two separate ones, it was decided to attempt a universal pattern. This pattern became the face of the American soldier for over a decade, until the Army then realized how ineffective this pattern was. The modern soldier now wears proper battle dress as the fight against terrorism continues in the Middle East. Army infantrymen primarily train at Fort Benning, Georgia, dubbed the home of the infantry. As of 2019, the U.S. Army introduced a new service uniform that harked back to the days of the Second World War and Korea,
it's all going back now.
Iteration of the pinks and greens. The uniform that the greatest generation made famous during the 1940s and 1950s. In Arlington National Cemetery, soldiers of the 3rd Infantry Regiment, dubbed the Old Guard, stand sentinel at the tomb of the unknown soldier. These sentinels remain as guardians 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, since April 1948. Their duty is to guard and honor those who died in combat, but whose identities remain unknown.
Hell yeah. Okay, so yeah, this is really cool because you can see the uniforms changing for sure, but you can also see the actual uniform become a part of the combat gear, which makes a lot of sense because back in the day it was more like ceremonial. They didn't really care so much about having it be effective for combats, and combat was very different back then as well. So as you see combat developing and modernizing and these weapons modernizing as far as getting like full auto machine guns and more accurate weapons and more accurate explosives like hand grenades and whatnot, you can see other stuff coming into play. So they have the flak, and then they start moving into like plate carriers. They have helmets. The helmets got more modern, a little bit lighter. Everything got a little bit more conducive for the infantrymen. And again, I don't really know what was getting modernized first. It seems like the weapons were getting a little bit more modernized, and then the uniforms kind of came a little bit after. But you can see for like World War I, they start wearing all the green and whatnot. They start introducing camouflage, and they start introducing stuff like eye protection and stuff to just help the infantrymen and also keep them in the fight a little bit longer. So you can see these uniforms that were built for like a ceremonial purpose, like creating an image for a young country, just slightly shift and then shift dramatically to something that's just more conducive for warfighting. And of course, now you have different uniforms that, you know, you have your ceremonial dress uniforms, and then you have stuff that you actually go and, you know, go to combat with and whatnot. So you have a combat uniform that looks like this, but then at the same time, you have something different, like a ceremonial uniform that looks like this. And of course, I mean, you're not going to want to use that ceremonial uniform in combat, but honestly, ceremonial uniforms are just part of the thing. You need to have this sort of appearance that people can get behind. But of course, if you guys have any other information, please put it down below, especially like any other influences as far as why some of these uniforms look the way they did. If you guys have any other information, please put it down below. We got a little bit of background in the video, which is kind of cool. But again, I mean, I'm sure they did their research, but you guys also know a lot of cool information too. So if you guys have any other stuff to add, please put it down below so we can sort of educate ourselves and learn a little bit more, because again, it's pretty cool to see where the U.S. Army was and sort of how it changed over the years. But yeah, I figured I'd do a little special video for Veterans Day. So yeah, definitely go out and thank those veterans that you guys know. So yeah, cool video, cool occasion to do this specific video, I think. So hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Hopefully you guys appreciate it. If there's any other crazy big holidays coming up, especially in your country, let me know down in the comment section. Give me a heads up so I can try and do a special video for that as well. But hopefully you guys enjoyed it. That is it for this video. I'll see you all in the next one.